Laying a controversial figure to rest, Cubans say goodbye to longtime leader Fidel Castro.
But here at home, calls for change as Miami's exile community hopes Castro's death ushers in a new era in Cuba.
We will take a look at what is next for the communist country as President-elect Donald Trump's administration begins to take shape. Good morning, and thanks for joining us for this special edition of This Week in South Florida.
Michael Putney is off, and Glenna Milberg has spent the last week in Cuba covering the death of Fidel Castro.
In fact, Local 10 has had crews in Cuba every single day since Castro's death was announced, and it is in Santiago de Cuba that we find our own Glenna Milberg and Calvin Hughes, who have covered every minute of this week-long goodbye to the communist leader. Good morning.
Todd, Nikki, good morning from Santiago de Cuba. In just about half an hour, 9 days of official mourning in this country comes to a close. The death of Fidel Castro is now almost over as an event. His ashes are now interred in a monument at the cemetery. We'll talk all about that. And it is an end of an era.
An end of an era, end of a chapter in Cuba's history, a long and controversial chapter in Cuba's history. But let's take you back to some of the events that have happened already. You talked about this week of mourning being chock full of events. Last night, the mass rally that took place at 7 o'clock. Like in Havana, tens of thousands of people were here, and oftentimes during the speeches, and even the speech of Raul Castro, the current leader of Cuba, there were people who were waving flags and chanting, "Yo soy Fidel, yo soy Fidel."
Chanting "Yo soy Fidel," wearing it on their body, on their face. These are people who, this is their chance, their public chance to say goodbye. A really interesting concept in a country where we know, whether by design or default or by tacitly unspoken terms, these are people who knew they had to be here, make a show of being here, whether they wanted to or not. And that was very clear to us with the people we spoke to.
And the history of what happens here in Cuba and what has happened with Cuban American exiles back there in South Florida, we are very much aware of. So we asked a number of people, not only in the neighborhoods, but also in Havana, were they forced to be here? And we got a range of responses from them as well.
A range of responses because there were a range of emotions, a range of perspectives, just like you would expect anywhere. There are people here who know nothing other than growing up in Fidel Castro's revolution and all that that entails. And one of the most interesting conversations we had this week was with a man named Rafael Molina, who is a Cuban dissident, who is a government opposition, who spoke with us and said, you know, I had asked him, these are people who say, look, they have free education and free medicine. They don't feel that they're not free at all. And his answer was, they don't know what freedom is because they've never seen it. And I think that's such a great concept to wrap your head around, that people don't know what they don't know, we included. And so the people who are here, who are really buying into what the revolution means, they might know otherwise.
Which is a good segue, because a lot of times we are asked about, you know, do you understand Cuba's history and Cuba's reality? Well, we are reporting Cuba's reality as we see it. People don't know what they don't know, and so they were telling us their reality is that we're doing just fine. I remember talking with a woman in her home, and I said, there are some Miami exiles who say the way you're living right now is the worst possible way that somebody could live over the course of 60 years, who were promised so much and got so little in return. And she told me, tell the Miami Cubans that we're doing just fine, leave us alone. You left here and now you're ungrateful for what you have over there. Leave us alone, we're doing just fine over here. So analyze that however you want.
You know, one of the hallmarks of the revolution is independence. And Fidel Castro, from the very beginning, told his people, we are going to be an independent country. We are going to be the David to the United States Goliath. And for 60 years, so much, as anyone who knows the history of Cuban American politics goes, so much has been about Cuba standing up to the United States. And I think you see this a lot. However, I will tell you, I was explaining to you earlier, a woman that we met this morning, an offhand conversation, a chance meeting on the street. She said she has relatives in the United States. She said they don't really ever send her anything. They don't really call her. And she said, the revolution is just not a life. And I thought that was A, very brave for her to say to us, and B, very telling that for many people here, recognize that if only economically, the revolution has not fulfilled the promises that Fidel Castro promised they would have.
And it is generational too, there's no doubt about that, how people stand with the revolution. But there are also some people that we spoke with who lined the streets waiting for that funeral procession earlier today of the remains, the cremated remains of Fidel Castro, to go by on its way to the Jose Marti Cemetery. Let's take a listen to what they had to say.
It's a very emotional moment, saying goodbye to the ashes of our comandante. We're standing firm by his legacy. The future of the town is the future that we, with the vision from the comandante, continue building.
And that was certainly the other side of what we talked about. You have a lot of opinions here, but also you had a chance to go out in the crowd. I mean, you were in the thick of it last night. And once again, we're not glorifying the fact that tens of thousands of people were here. It's just reality. People were lined up, stretching back for blocks. But you had a chance to talk with a lot of people last night.
We did, and last night there were people literally bussed in. There were people bussed in and placed. There were also a lot of people and families who came on their own. Might I say there was no security at all, and apparently none needed here, and we can talk about that later if you like. But the world leaders sitting on the stage, the people in the crowd, there were so many people from different countries. And when you look out, you see a lot of little Cuban flags, a lot of big Cuban flags, but last night you saw flags from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil,
Venezuela.
There were, and that goes without saying. There was so much international presence, and a repeated theme when asked, what is the connection here? The answer is Fidel Castro represents to these people, revolution represents to these people, a kind of socialism that appeals to countries where a majority of the population live in poverty.
That's right.
Socialism is an appealing concept to them. And they look at this revolution and what it has done and not done, and they look at the propaganda, we are still fighting, we are going to win. And that's very appealing to the people here last night who are not Cuban and not from Cuba.
And so for the rally last night, it began at 7 o'clock promptly, ended just after 8 o'clock with the speaker, the main speaker being Raul Castro. The other speakers were people who were not from other countries, not heads of state. But Raul Castro made it pretty clear that the revolution will continue in terms of what he's hoping will happen with this country. But again, when he said that not only in Havana at the mass rally, he said that last night, but what does that really mean?
That's a good question.
What is that? I mean, it was sort of
what he said last night, it was a clarion call. He didn't just say it, he exhorted the crowd to repeat it. Yeah. And some say that without the physical presence of a Fidel Castro, there is a very large question looming. Will his revolution remain, we have the ability to remain intact as it is now? And there are many people who look at the rule for the last 10 years of Raul Castro, still with Fidel, a physical presence, and sometimes second guessing the moves that he'd made. And now that the physical man isn't here, the presence isn't here, what will happen? And what Raul Castro did last night is say to this crowd, we're going to go forward together just the same way. And they answered as if rehearsed.
And to play off of that, one thing that he did make clear, if they do nothing else, David will continue to stand up against Goliath, Goliath being the U.S. I think we have time. Let's quickly take a listen to what Raul Castro had to say last night during his speech.
Ese es el Fidel invicto.
That is the victorious Fidel.
Que nos convoca con su ejemplo.
Who asked us to follow his example.
Y con la demostración de que.
He showed us that.
Sí se pudo.
Yes, we could.
Sí se puede.
Yes, we can.
Y sí se podrá.
And yes, we will.
And the chants that we talked about, yes, we can, yes, we will. I found something striking about Raul Castro as he was up there. Even at 85 years old, I know the voice is a little grovelly at that point, but he sounded to me a little exhausted and obviously emotional.
No doubt a lot of people here are exhausted. It's been a very long week. no doubt he's emotional. His brother has died, but I think that's a faction of age and exhaustion. I'm not going to be the one to assign why that was, but I agree.
Right.
That's just what he sounded like, and the crowd was much more animated than he was in response. That said, let's take a quick break. We have so much more to bring you from there and from here, and we will see you in just a couple of minutes.
Calvin and Glenna, thank you.
Of course, we will hear more from Calvin and Glenna in just a few minutes, but after the break, we are going to take a closer look at what could be next for Cuba as well as the exile community.
Welcome back to this special edition of This Week in South Florida. We'll be checking in with our crews in Cuba throughout the hour, but for now, we want to discuss what Fidel Castro's death means for the future of Cuba and the exile community, particularly here in South Florida.
So let's introduce you to our panel. Dr. Frank Mora is the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center at Florida International University. He's also served as Deputy Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere.
And Humberto Diaz-Arguelles is the president of the Brigade 2506 Veterans Association and the famed invasion force involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, gentlemen. Physically, Fidel Castro no longer an influence, but certainly everyone knows that his presence will be felt for years to come. Humberto, I want to start with you. You certainly have a personal perspective on the events of this week. Your thoughts on the death of Fidel?
Well, this is something that has been in our minds for many, many years. What was going to happen the day that Fidel Castro is gone? It has not caught us by surprise. We are expecting exactly the same thing. The tyranny and the dictatorship will continue in Cuba. The only thing that's going to be missing is the image and the myth of Fidel Castro. Raúl is going to be stronger than ever. He's going to apply more pressure and fear to the public, to the citizens, in order to maintain power. And those that are in power also are going to help out to keep their power. But I think there's going to be some controversy in the positions that they're going to held.
Well, in fact, in last night's speech, he, as Glenna had mentioned, he did say that the revolution would continue. But the question is how?
Yeah, and can it?
Well, I think I agree with him, but in the short term, I think we shouldn't be expecting major changes. This is, the dictator is gone, but the dictatorship continues. And I think there is going to be some sort of bunkering down in the short term for fear of the consequences that this might have. But I think we've entered a post-Fidel period for some time, and Raúl was very much in the seat and making decisions, some of which were not acceptable, I suspect, to Fidel Castro, much like the normalization relations with the United States. So in the short term, we should not expect major changes. I think the change, in my view, will occur when that generation of Cuban leadership, those around Raúl, will pass from the scene. And I don't mean stepping down, I mean biology doing its work. And then the sort of second generation or third generation comes into office. That's where I think the dynamic changes, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen in Cuba at that point.
Go ahead. Sorry.
This past week, we've seen the Cuban exile community energized, and a lot of their children and grandchildren coming into the fold, again, listening to the conversation and getting re-energized and reconnected with their roots. The Cuban Americans have come to this country, Cubans have come to this country, and they multiplied, and now they're bigger. Now, does that the American voters, the ones that are American, are they going to put any pressure on this next administration to do more? And is that going to make a difference?
The next administration has been very clear as to what it wants to do before the election and after the election. It wants to reverse everything that President Obama has done. Now, I don't know what that exactly means. Does that mean that no more remittances to Cuba? Does that mean no more travel to Cuba? We will have to see what the new administration says.
Well, but President-elect Trump has lightened his stance on several campaign promises that he's made.
But not on this one.
That he rolls back on some of those promises that he's made about Cuba.
He has tweeted after the election, and his advisors has said clearly that we want to return basically to a failed policy of 55 years. That's what he said. And I think we have to pull the string on that and understand what that means. Does that mean the end of remittances? Does that mean that we can no longer support Cuban families in Cuba? If that's what is in play, then we should be honest with our viewers here and tell them that's what's going to happen. Because unless that's what happens, then any symbolic move will be only that, symbolic, and will have no change. And the Cuban American community, or some people, I should say, in the Cuban American community, have an expectation that that will happen.
Do you think he will sever diplomatic ties with the island?
I don't know. We don't know. So he's only said reverse, but we don't know how far it will go. Will it go to a period of the Cold War, or will it go to a period of George W. Bush? We don't know yet, but there will be change and there will be consequences for those who want to have some relationship with families and friends on the island.
Watching the coverage, Glenna and Calvin, such a terrific job, but watching the coverage this week, I was really surprised at the stark differences between the exile community and the people in Cuba, at least what we've been able to report there. Is the divide simply growing between
Let me tell you this
the two?
much. When I was in prison in Cuba after the Bay of Pigs failure, in 1962, in the Prince Castle in prison, Fidel came to see us and says, I'm going to give a great concentration of the masses right there in the Plaza Cívica, which is the real name, not the Plaza de Revolución, has nothing to do. That was built way before he took power. And he said, I'm going to show you who I am. So in about 3 weeks, all of a sudden we had speakers all over the place, and we were asking, what is going on? All of a sudden you see the Plaza Cívica full of people being brought in buses and trailers, all kinds of people to fill the plaza. So what I'm giving you this story is because they are trained and very experienced to mobilize people wherever they wish. So right now, what they are showing to the world is a myth. It's like you say, what's the truth, what's a lie, and what's a myth? They are trying to continue with that myth of the glorious image of Fidel Castro, which would never been like that because they were marketing their way of government. So to us, I've seen this since 1962. Nothing of this is catching me by surprise.
Simply propaganda, and as Glenna said, the Cuban people only know what they know.
That's it, and in some cases, they don't even know. As a matter of fact, if you ask them, where's the Bay of Pigs? They don't even know what the Bay of Pigs is.
I have to imagine, though, the leaders have seen what's going on here in Miami. How important was it for them to show this homegoing for Fidel in a grand a way as possible?
It's a way of trying to strengthen their position and sending messages, true or not, that they're united. At a time when the historic figure dies and there's the potential of a change in U.S. policy, they're going to hunker down and hunker down hard, and they're going to fall to the default of a confrontation with the United States, a script that they know how to play very well and they feel very comfortable in playing. And that's unfortunate because I think that the repression that we've seen in Cuba over the last few years is in many ways not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness and insecurity about what the change in U.S. policy had created on the ground, and they were going to take preventive measures to avoid anything from getting out of control.
Local 10 has received both praise and criticism for our coverage of the death of Fidel. I mean, this has been a very difficult story to cover with so many emotional ties. What are the exiles saying in the community about our coverage?
Well, let me tell you something in general. Of course, let's go general with the press. Sometimes some comments are, and some of them are valid, that there was not a balanced information. It was more a good thing for Hillary, and everything that came bad about Trump, it was all day playing on TV, while the bad thing of Hillary was shown maybe once or twice, and that was it. So that's the impression that I've heard on the streets, that it was not balanced. Yes, it was given to the public, but not at the same rate. Like politicians demand the same time to speak in front of a camera when they are campaigning. Not this time.
Frank, you've been watching the coverage. What do you think?
I think, this is all in the eye of the beholder.
Everything is, take it.
Everything is, yeah, I'm sure. It's your job to take it, right? I think everything is relative. I could say the same thing about how Trump was covered versus Hillary, how certain issues are covered, but that depends on our own personal biases. I think your job is to present the information and take the hits and be responsible in terms of revealing and putting a light on everything that goes on. That's, I think, to me, your job. And so when there are in the new administration conflicts of interest, I hope and expect that you will all cover that.
Frank Mora, Humberto Arguelles, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, we're going to take this and more on as Donald Trump's new administration comes to power. We're going to have continue our Powerhouse Roundtable after the break.
Glenna and Calvin will join us once again. It's time now for our Powerhouse Roundtable. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get to it. First, we're going to start with our introductions. Marlon Hill is a Miami attorney with the Hamilton, Miller, and Berthasell firm and a past president of the Caribbean Bar Association, a frequent guest.
Jessica Fernandez is the president of Miami Young Republicans and was a delegate at the GOP convention in Cleveland this past summer.
Andrea Johnson is a veteran journalist who is an editor and reporter with the Miami Times and formerly with the Miami Herald.
And of course, we have Local 10's own Calvin Hughes and Glenna Milberg live in Santiago de Cuba. We wrap up an historic week that has looked back at Fidel Castro's life by looking forward at what, if any, changes may come to the island in the future. And Marlon, I want to get to you first and find out if you believe that the passing of Fidel could usher in any changes, even subtle ones.
Well, I don't think so in the short term, but ultimately there's a leadership transition and a leadership vacuum. On the island in Cuba, and of course it's a huge impact here in Miami. You know, I call it what the Fidelometer of, you know, the span of emotions that they are, both those who despise Fidel, you know, all the things that he's done in terms of against human rights and against families and stuff like that. So, and there's some people, you know, impact across the world that there is an impact as well, where some people may not understand having to do with the revolution as well.
Yeah, we have talked about the coverage that we've given and the coverage that we've had here in Miami. You're also from the Caribbean and other places around the world have had a different view of the coverage and this week.
I think it would be negligent for the station not to cover this story. I mean, he has had an impact on history, negative and positive, and that's what I call the Fidelometer, right? Because it is there, so you have to cover it and tell the story. Some people may not like it, some people may not love it. For me, you know, I lost my dad.
I'll let you read our email feed.
I'm sure. You know, I lost my dad last year, and my cousin, who was the family historian, revealed a marriage certificate with my paternal grandmother from Camagüey, Cuba. Yeah. You know, I have no idea of any connection of the family in Cuba when they went back to Jamaica, because, you know, they're Caribbean islands. That's what people tend to forget, that Cuba is right there in the Caribbean region.
Yeah, well, Calvin and Glenn are the ones that have been walking this tightrope. You have taken great pains, I think, Calvin and Glenna, to tell this story as fairly as possible. Have you found yourself second-guessing yourselves?
Second guessing, I would say, I don't want to speak for you.
No.
I will say the most, the most challenging assignment in my professional life, having grown up in the community where my friends are exiles and lived the pain that comes with that. The most challenging thing I think we do here is reporting very objectively that there are two realities to people, and maybe more than two realities, and each is a valid reality, because if you don't walk in someone else's shoes, you don't realize that 100% of what they say is 100% right, even though 100% of what they say here is 100% right. So it has been very challenging to be the kind of reporter that telegraphs how respectful and mindful we are of all of those things, and tell the kind of story that is a worthy story and an important story to tell.
You know, I love the tweet that we got. Can't believe you're covering the Castro funeral. This is from someone back in South Florida. How are you going to do it? Your response was respectfully and mindfully and carefully. So that's how you cover this story. But I also think, look, people are going to have their opinion one way or the other. We have to be on the side of truth. As journalists, our job is to be like a baseball umpire. We call the balls and strikes. We call it as we see it. Our job is not to give our opinions one way or the other about what we think about Cuban exiles, the Cuban government. This is a story that has many fathers. We're serving a lot of people who are watching our information, who are waiting to see what we're going to say. critiquing every possible angle that we take, the Cuban government, we have the Cuban exiles who are watching, and then the folks who are here wanting to know, what are you going to do with that story when you put me on television? So we have to be extra careful about how we cover a story. That's what makes it so difficult, is because, simply because we have so many people who are watching.
One very important email we got from somebody in South Florida was, please don't call Fidel Castro president.
Yeah.
He's not elected and he's not a president. That's true. Here, they call Fidel Castro president. We are guests in a sovereign nation, mindful of being respectful to the nation we are reporting on. Here, they call him president. There, he's not a president as Americans would know that. So which of those is right?
And can I also say one thing very quickly back to Marlon there. Jamaica was represented up on that stage yesterday, and also at the mass rally in Havana on Tuesday, because Marlon knows all too well that Fidel Castro was very good friends with the Prime Minister, I believe some 20 years ago, and there was a Prime Minister in Jamaica who very much wanted, and possibly was moving Jamaica into the system of communism and socialism. Michael Manley, if I'm not mistaken.
I would love to hear from Jessica at the table, because she's a young, what we would call a young Cuban American, and her impression of what she sees her contemporaries here this week, and her impressions on what's to come when that generation takes power.
I think we need to really realize that there has been a vacuum of information in Cuba. So the two realities that we're talking about is one, a reality that is based in a vacuum, that where you don't have any outside influence, you don't have any outside information to contest or to challenge the point of view. So I think, us here, myself as a young Cuban American leader in this community, we know very well the pain and the destruction that was caused by Fidel Castro, and for us this represents an opportunity to move the conversation forward, to empower the people of Cuba to have the ability to enact democratic change. There's a lot of people that see this, like Rosa Maria Paya and the people that work with her in Cuba, they see this as a moment to kind of reinvigorate the movement, to put this to a plebiscite, put it to the people for them to decide for themselves. We oftentimes get caught up in the details of, should this be the coverage or should this be the coverage? But I think most importantly, we need to be thinking about how can we empower people in Cuba to inform themselves. So I think that the death of Fidel represents a break from the past, and I think it represents an opening to, with the coverage that's all going in, with all the international media attention. I think there's an opportunity for Cubans on the ground to get additional information about what's going on and how the world views them. I think that's very important.
The big question, Jessica, is how do we do that, right?
Right.
And we're moving into the transition of presidential leadership, where you have two bipolar opposites of how to approach and engage Cuba, how to empower Cubans, how do they get the information, where do we engage, what foreign policy are we going to embolden Cubans from around the world to have a say and the space to determine the future of their country.
Yeah, well, hold that thought. It's a good place for us to pause right now.
And you get first crack.
Yes,
when we come back,
you're first.
Don't you worry.
Yes, a good place to segue as we go to break. When we come back, we're going to talk about that and much more here with our Powerhouse Roundtable. Welcome back to our Powerhouse Roundtable with Marlon Hill, Jessica Fernandez, and Andrew Robinson. We're going to start with Ms. Robinson. You've been listening in.
Yes,
you get first.
Very patiently.
You get to first go.
I think that as this is an opportunity for us on this side and also in Cuba to look at how we go from here, and for the Cubans on the island and Cuban Americans and the broader community, how do we help shape or speak about the new Cuba, so to speak? I think that there is a diversity of thought, and the incoming president needs to hear that and take that into consideration. I don't think a hardline approach is going to work. I don't think that we don't want where Cuba is right now. If Cuba were to, because Putin is with Donald Trump, where are they going to go?
Right.
Could they go to China, which would be disastrous, in my opinion?
Yeah.
Well, Jessica, you were a delegate at the GOP convention. Do you want to see President-elect Donald Trump reverse all the executive orders the minute he gets into office?
I mean, I think that we seriously need to reconsider the administrative actions that Obama took as president. I think that, you know, clearly people in our community, Cuban Americans voted for Donald Trump because they agreed with his policy.
Okay, but seriously consider, does that mean you get to cherry pick, or does he reverse them?
I mean, I don't have the insight into what Donald's line of thought is, but I think he surrounded himself with, you know, very established Cuban-American leaders such as Mauricio Claron. You have A.J. Delgado. You have other Cuban-Americans that have joined his transition team. So I think he's getting a lot of information from people that have studied this issue, people that have lived this issue, people that have a huge connection to this issue. And, you know, Cuban-Americans did not vote for any politician in South Florida that favored rapprochement. They did not. They elected Corbello. They elected Marco Rubio because they have a worldview that represents the worldview that this community has.
But if you remove the politics out of it, though, Jessica, and just say, okay, the Cuban people, take Republicans, the Democrats off the table, what's the most appropriate, reasonable policy that will allow the future of Cuba to move forward, right? That's really the big question, right?
I think that we need to ask the Castro, you know, Raul Castro, what are the concessions that he's going to give to open up the country to his people to have not just economic liberties, but have liberties that we enjoy here as Americans. I mean, there's not an ability to express yourself freely. There's only one party. There's only one thought that's accepted. When you don't toe that line in Cuba, you get sent to jail. So I think that if we're going to be talking about the changes that we want to see more freedoms and liberty. Why are the people in Cuba slaves making less than $20 a month as a professional? You know, I think that until Cubans can have a better economy for themselves, they're just struggling every day to figure out how they're going to feed themselves.
Let's go to Cuba, because we got Calvin and Glenna right there. It's the largest roundtable in This Week in South Florida history. Guys, I know you're just itching to weigh in. What do you think?
Well, and can I tell you, it's really odd to be on this side of the camera. It's so fascinating here with the limited contact with outside news other than state-run news, how much people know about Donald Trump and the fact that Trump has said he is going to be reversing the opening that Cuba has with the United States, and they are very concerned about that here.
You know, there is so much that he would have to do because President Obama has all but stripped the U.S. embargo of just being just this figurative law to keep, obviously, trade and other business dealings with Cuba between the Cuban government and U.S. government. But also he has a lot more to do in terms of the cruise ships that have come here, the airlines. There's a lot that Trump would have to pull away and do away with in order for that deal to kind of...
The toothpaste is out of the tube.
Exactly, yeah, basically. So, you know, I think in theory he would like to nix the deal, but the deal has already sort of been done.
Yeah, you see a lot of Americans here, and we met a couple of American, I can't call them tourists because they can't call themselves tourists because they're people-to-people visitors, but they're tourists. And a lot of Americans are here, and the Cuban people love that, welcome it, and want more.
Well, President Obama made sweeping changes with the stroke of a pen. I don't see why President-elect Trump couldn't do the same thing. Could he not?
Well, he could, but I think that if he does, he's taking money away from the Cubans on the island. Because one thing with more people from this country going over there, they're getting dollars. They're getting the tips, the taxi drivers, the waiters, waitresses, and other Cubans who work in that particular industry. They weren't getting that before unless you have someone here who's sending remittances. And I will say for Afro-Cubans, Cubans of African descent, that helps them more probably than anyone else. You're not seeing them here on this side or over there in those crowds. You're not seeing as many of those people, and they depend on that. People who I know who visit there specifically go out and seek Afro-Cubans so they can give them money.
The funny thing about politics, Todd, is that, you know, when you talk about income and prosperity, it's not race specific, right? Because even though Afro-Cubans benefit from many of the things here in this country, there's a big fight over politics.
Exactly,
right?
it sure is.
That's going to be the real marker as to how do you determine the policy. This is why politics is the dance, right? Of how do you balance policy and who benefits from budgets and
exactly.
money.
But Cubans can't buy things in the Cuban markets with the dollars that they receive. They have to buy in Cuban convertible currency. So let's be clear that there's a two standard. There's the tourist standard and the military elite,
but they still
and then there's
have
the regular
whatever
Cuban
the currency
who is not allowed.
They still have that. They didn't have it before. So at least let's give them that.
I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that they have so much improved.
I did not say improve.
Are not benefiting in the way that we think that they are.
They're benefiting more than they had been with tourists coming over there.
It's difficult to think that an infusion of foreign money like that cannot have some sort of an impact.
Oh, I'm sure it's having an impact, and it's definitely impacting the Castro regime enrich itself.
And isn't that why they made all these concessions? Because their economy is failing. Their economy is floundering.
Take the tourism economy off the table. What about remittances, where you can send money to your immediate family? Who's able to send money to their family and has a connection to their family there may benefit more? So we have to look at all of that.
Exactly.
Because if we're going to send money to Cuba through tourism or remittances, all Cuba has to benefit.
Exactly.
Everywhere.
And that's the conversation we have not had. I've lived in South Florida for 26 years. I haven't heard that from media, and I was at the Miami Herald for 20 years.
How about wet foot, dry foot? Where does that go?
Well, and that's another thing. Some of my friends, we were talking about that. That's another one. When this happened, when this man died, my friends were like, well, what about the Haitians? What's going to happen?
This little Caribbean island has such a huge impact on Miami and South Florida.
Exactly.
It's very important that both Cubans and non-Cubans pay very close attention to this response because it impacts us. It impacts our economy, it impacts our co-workers, impacts people that we differ with.
Well, unfortunately, Marlon, I brought up
you opened the can of worms.
I did, yes. It's a little late in the game.
And we're going to have to screw the cap on it.
We're going to put the genie back in the bottle on that. We'll talk more about wet foot, dry foot in the future, yes.
After the break, more from Local 10's Calvin Hughes and Glenna Milberg in Santiago de Cuba, following the death and funeral of longtime Cuban leader Fidel Castro.
And welcome back to This Week in South Florida. And, you know, part of being in some of the right places at the right time is just making sure that you're in position. And this morning, our producer here, Michelle, was in the right position to get the funeral procession as it went by. And it was really just one of those moments that we were on the front lines of history. Yeah?
And may we just set this up a little bit by saying all of what we've been talking about between the politics of exile and Cuba comes down to the experience of personality, family, loss. Michelle, our producer, is experiencing this trip personally and professionally at the same time, and I can't think of a better person to describe what was going through your mind when you saw those ashes go by today.
Professionally, being in the media, understanding that this week is a tremendous opportunity to be here to cover this story, I'm honored. But personally, as I watch that go by, I get emotional. Cubans here, understandably, are mourning Fidel Castro. I understand and respect that. But at the same time, I started to cry and I got emotional over what he represented to my family, to all the families living in exile in South Florida. He portrayed himself to be this larger-than-life type of person, and to see him reduced to ashes in this tiny little casket as he just drove by, to witness that and represent my family, it was a complete honor, surreal. It's a lot of things going in my mind.
Was there at any point a moment where you said, now it's over? Or is it?
It's not. It's not, because although he's been out of power for, what, 10 years now?
10 years.
It really doesn't, nothing has changed. Raul is still in power, carrying on the traditions, the ideals, and I don't think that it's over. I don't know if it will be over.
But I've heard some Cuban Americans use the word closure. Can you find closure with at least one half of the Cuban Revolution now passed away, now over?
Perhaps. Maybe many people in South Florida can say that because perhaps their families were political prisoners or they lost loved ones. I fortunately can say that none of my family members were imprisoned. No one was killed. But for me, I don't feel a sense of closure.
You know, one of the things that we had talked about a lot was the day of Fidel Castro's death and the celebrating in the streets of South Florida. And so many of us observing that, knowing what an incredible moment that was for someone whose lives were utterly destroyed by one man. And here you've had a chance to see the other side of the coin. And I know we've heard people here who thought that was, you know, they were upset by that.
Absolutely.
Give us your impressions of that kind of yin and yang.
I think you guys expressed it eloquently. Two sides having different views over one man.
That's right.
Here he's revered, he's admired, he's considered a part of their family. The nationalism, the pride, whether it's coerced, whether it's forced, whether they feel it truly. I see it, I understand it, I respect it, that's their view. However, coming from South Florida, being a family of Cuban exiles, I understand, I have my own view. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's understood. Both sides, I understand both sides, respect both sides, but I have a different view.
And we have about 60 seconds here, and there was a reporter from Portugal who interviewed all of us and seemed to be enamored by the fact that we have to cover the story just a little bit differently than most people who were here around the world.
Yeah, he asked if we found trouble being objective, and I don't think that we have. If anything, I think we feel more responsibility.
Absolutely.
Amen, sister. Thank you. May I?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
A great experience.
Yes.
Nikki, Todd, we'll send it back to you.
Yeah, can't wait for you guys to get home. We'll have a big group hug. We're just keeping the seat warm for you, Glenna. Come home. Nikki and I have been up since 3 a.m.
Great job, guys.
After the break, Trent will be here with another look at your Sunday forecast. Don't go anywhere.
The world is reacting to the death of Fidel Castro.
Local 10 News is first.
Local 10, the only South Florida station live here in Havana.
First to announce the death of Fidel Castro.
Today, it is the death of a dictator.
First to cover the emotion of South Florida.
The emotion here is so raw. Thank you for telling our story.
First and only station on the ground in Cuba live.
Behind me, thousands are beginning to pour into the Plaza of the Revolution right now.
Have been waiting for hours.
People in line as far as the eye can see.
The only station with a team of journalists across the island.
Past the thousands of mourners.
The emotions that these people feel.
And the only station you need when big news breaks.
The mass rally is set to begin here in Santiago de Cuba.
Local 10 is the news station.
Local 10 has been on the island since the beginning.
Controversial chapter in Cuba's history closing with the death of Fidel Castro.
That covers news everywhere.
Local 10 News has crews spanning from South Florida to Cuba.
Period. The one and only Local 10 News.
Let's take a live look out of our Mount Sinai Medical Center camp. A little bit of shaking going on, 78 degrees.
A lot going on this weekend. You got Riptide in Fort Lauderdale. It's a big music festival right on the beach.
Down in Miami, you got Art Basel.
We got to get to Weather Authority meteorologist Trent Eric to find out what your Sunday forecast is like. Trent?
And good afternoon, South Florida. I'm meteorologist Trent Eric. It's been cloudy morning and now some sunshine beginning to peek through. And as we go throughout the day, our temperatures will hold here in the low 80s. You can see right now on the radar, things are pretty quiet across town. Just a 10% chance of a shower as we go throughout the rest of the afternoon into the evening. Now, a warm east wind will continue. You feel it when you walk outside. The humidity's come up just a touch today, and that may drive one of those showers or two. And most of those have been located down over the Florida Straits for this afternoon, especially early this morning. So there's the wind near 15 miles per hour. It's gusting along the coast in the low 20s. That's going to keep our temperatures tonight around 74 degrees. And so with passing clouds and a mild start earlier today, we're going to see the east wind persist, and it's going to bring in partly cloudy skies. And then as we look ahead towards the start of the work week, a little bit more out of the southeast that'll allow our temperatures to come up to 83 degrees while we still have a low rain chance. But by the time Wednesday gets here, a 50% chance. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And of course, I'll be back here tonight at 5, 6, and 11 to walk you through your forecast.
All right. And it says it's going to get nice and cold next weekend.
I'm going to get my boots out.
Yeah. Well, that is going to do it for us right now. We want to know, what do you think?
We invite you to weigh in on any topic you'd like. Email, Facebook, Twitter at any of these addresses. We're easy to find. Michael Putney, Glenna Milberg. There you see the show. And on Twitter, you know, just don't email Todd and I. We're just filling in. Glenna's going to be back next week.
She can't get back soon enough. She will be here weighing in on these issues next weekend, and we're just keeping the chair warm, as I mentioned earlier. So for that, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for joining us.
To quote Michael Putney, stay engaged, and get involved.
Here we go.